Hi everyone, Mike G here. This project I broke into two videos. The first one, which is this one, is on the construction without any electronics. The second video will be on the electronics and the LED lighting. Now there's three reasons why I did this project. The obvious one is I wanted to add some storage, but I wanted to have that storage accessible from either side without running into the garage mechanism. And third, I wanted to add a light without adding space, taking away space from the height. Now note the difference between these two. The one on the right is my first version, and the one on the left is what I consider the improved version. It uses 1/2-inch plywood instead of 3/4, which is why it has the rail down the middle, and it uses a brighter and more of them LEDs. Also note that the one on the right, I'm going to replace those LEDs so that it matches both the color temperature and brightness of the unit on the left. Alright, so here's an animation file that SketchUp puts together for me. What you see is the way the shelf is mounted to the ceiling. You see two cross members there, and that's because when you look at the joist above the ceiling, you'll see that I need to attach to them one way, and the other one can just be in line on the joist itself. The design is very simply just 3 feet wide, 7.5 feet long, and just really a piece of 1/2-inch plywood on top of some cut up 2x4s. So we look underneath here, that orange box is the power supply, and the red cover with the holes is so the power supply can vent. This is covered up by a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. Those gray stripes you see, that's actually plastic covering over LED strips. This view shows how the slots are cut into the plywood. I use a circular saw to cut those at about a 19-20 degree angle. And then you can see how the plastic is inserted into those slots. This view simply shows the frame and the dimensions. And this next view that's coming up here is the end view, shows the dimensions for the plywood and the cut up 2x4s as well as the cover. Here's the parts list for what's covered in this video. Some plywood, some studs, screws, and this router bit which I need to trim things up, which we'll show in the video later. Alright, here we're cutting some 2x4s. Altogether we have two 2x4s that we'll be cutting here. One is for the 7'6" length, and the other one's for the cross members. So next up, we need to rip these by running them through the saw lengthwise. Overall, it takes 9 cuts to make the 3 dimensions I need. I'm not going to show them all. So here I'm cutting the smaller pieces that are used to make up the power supply section. And because I didn't really rip them correctly, I had to go back and cut some back down to the 1-inch metric. I also need slots to run the wires, so I do a data sort of type cut here on the pieces that are making up the power supply section. Okay, next up is to put pocket holes and everything. So the way this is put together, basically, I do pocket holes to hold the whole thing together, except for that small assembly you see here where I first glued it together, so it would be easier. And I'm not going to show all the drilling. Alright, now it's time for all the pocket screws. You know, I always have trouble keeping these things lined up, so I really got to clamp them down well before I put these screws in so they don't move at all. And just goes on forever, all these pocket screws. Okay, so now it's time to start cutting the plywood. I set up my straight edge here and just ran my little circular saw down there, cutting about 1 foot off. I used a jig I made to make this shorter cut. So now it's time to cut those angled grooves. And I've got 4 of them, 2 on each side, so that's what I'm doing here. I got the saw set up at about somewhere between 18 and 20 degrees. And once these 2 are done, I'll spin the board around and I'll do the other 2. Alright, now I'm getting ready to attach the plywood to the 2x2s here. And I just took a board and I pre-drilled a bunch of holes 8 inches apart so I could just put that in place and quickly line up the spots so I could pre-drill all the holes for the screws. And I screwed all those in. Here I'm doing a cutout for the power supply venting. And I cut this a little big so that I could come back with the router and that trim bit I showed earlier to just make this nice clean cut here. So I cut the plywood about 1/4 inch too big in each dimension. This allowed me to place it on with just a little bit of overlap. And here I'm going around it, just trimming it even with the frame. And this will make the paint go on much nicer. So this is the 1/4 inch plywood, just cutting it to size. It'll fit nicely on the frame there, as you can see. And as you can see, I'm trimming it pretty much the same way I've done everything else. Look at those nice clean edges. So here I'm changing the blade to a metal cutting blade. It's a smaller blade, 7¼ inches. So to minimize any risk of sparks causing problems, I covered up the metal with a piece of scrap wood. So for this piece of metal that I just cut, I'm using some spray adhesive so I can stick on this template for drilling the holes. So next I use some double-sided tape, put one side on the metal and another side on a piece of scrap so that when I drilled my holes I didn't pull the metal up. To clean all the residue, I used what I had laying around, which in this case was paintbrush cleaner. It seemed to work pretty good. And I also drilled some smaller holes for screwing into the plywood. So here I'm just sanding down all the sharp edges all the way around. So with bare wood, I feel you really need to put down a primer first before you put down the color. So that's what I'm doing here. For the color, I did the trim part first, cutting in all the sides and whatnot. Then I followed it up with the roller. Once I got done painting, I went and made sure that all the paint was worked out of the slots while it was still wet. Well, thank you all for watching, as this concludes part 1 of the 2-part series. In the second part, we're going to talk about how the LEDs get attached to the surface, how they get wired into the power supply, and how we hook up the AC into the power supply, and also how we put the covers over the LEDs.